So, Jeff, this week I'm on a secret mission to do a bit of research in the associate office of HARDFACTS, and all of a sudden we get this huge dump from Rand Paul, which is absolutely spectacular, to be honest. And I don't think it's fully appreciated what he has found out. And I guess we should really get into that and demonstrate and show why this stuff is so important. So, there's basically three components to this. I'll just kind of start off very quickly here, and then we can talk about each one of them one by one. So I'd say the most important part is that there was a guy called Vincent Muster from NIAID, Fauci's office, who was part of this DEFUSE proposal, which is Daszak's blueprint for making COVID in a lab, in the Wuhan lab. That's number one. We'll talk about that. I think the second one is the fact that 15 US government agencies knew about this proposal in 2018, and yet everyone kept quiet, after COVID arrived. That's, I think, huge as well. And then thirdly, Samantha Power, the head of USAID, denies that USAID was paying for gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan lab. But we have the proof that that's exactly what they did.
Well, Samantha Power also said she didn't unmask people, and she's listed as doing hundreds of those, so we have that. This dovetails into something what we've been talking about for a long time. We were making a point in an earlier show that we had some emails that had been released that showed that there was broader knowledge of the DEFUSE proposal and people stayed quiet. But this is an entirely different level of knowledge. What Rand Paul brought forth is that, as you said, 15 different federal agencies were involved and knew of the DEFUSE proposal. And as we've said many, many times on this show, the DEFUSE proposal is so detailed, so specific. It's clear they were already carrying out some of the work before the proposal for the funding itself was made. But the fact that don't lose sight of the fact that this proposal is a blueprint for COVID. It's that specific. It's definitive. So the fact that there were so many people within the federal government that knew what was going on, we don't have a number, right? As I understand it, it's somewhere, has to be minimum of several hundred. It could be in the thousands. But at a bare minimum, several hundred people were aware of the DEFUSE proposal. And then when COVID hit, they had to know what was going on. It's impossible that they didn't. And nobody stepped forward to say, hey, wait a minute, we got a problem. What about this proposal? Is this tied into anything? Yeah, they didn't even have to come out and say definitively that's what happened, but they could have said something about it. Instead, everyone clammed up and stayed quiet all these years.
When I was a kid, I was told that conspiracy theories aren't true, cannot be true, because as soon as you have too many people involved, as soon as there's more than like 3-4 people, someone's going to talk.
Right.
But as you just said, there are so many people involved here. I mean, let's just get into the detail, because there's been sort of some pushback on Rand Paul saying that there were 15 agencies involved. By the way, they were. We have, it's documented, and let's put them up here. All the 15. I'm not going to read them all out, but let's just put it up here. So those are the 15 agencies. By the way,
one of the things that I was told growing up was lying by omission is still lying.
Well, and in this case, I mean, my entire perception of conspiracy theories is kind of turned on its head since COVID, because by and large, I did believe this mantra that you cannot have a conspiracy theory if it involves, say, 12 or 24 people or more. And in this case, as you said, we have a lot more. I just didn't think it was possible, but it is possible. It's documented. It actually happened. So it's just because there's been some pushback, and some people on Twitter have said, no way there were 15 agencies or whatever. Well, yes, there were 15 agencies, and maybe not all of them were like specifically involved in getting DEFUSE executed. But let's just briefly discuss here what happened before we move on to the Vincent Muster guy. I mean, that is probably even bigger news, but let's stick to the 15 agencies here. So in early 2018, DARPA, which is the Defense Agency for Research Agency, they put out a proposers day. They had a proposers day. It's like a conference, like an event where a lot of people got together. And Peter Daszak made a presentation at that event about DEFUSE, about what they wanted to do with these viruses. Now, it is true that Peter Daszak publicly said that this was all going to happen in North Carolina. Privately, as we discussed previously on the show, he actually wanted to do it in Wuhan once he got the 14 million that he was asking for. But let's leave that aside. So his presentation would have been, we got these bad viruses. There was a PowerPoint. I don't think we've seen the PowerPoint, but we know that that's what happened on that day. So I gave a short presentation. It would have had the virus. We want to insert these things. We want to see how infectious they are. We want to do all these, magic tricks with the virus, basically manipulating it. A SARS virus. As you said, the DEFUSE proposal is very, very detailed. Now, the PowerPoint wouldn't have been that detailed, but anyone in that room would have understood what's going on, that these guys want to manipulate SARS viruses. So when 1 year later, the guy who did the presentation, who is also deeply entangled with the Wuhan lab, when 1 year later there is exactly such a virus that shows up, how is it possible that no one of the people in the room, and that included 15 government agencies, didn't pipe up, as you said, like, hey, maybe we ought to look at that and so on. And then, of course, it goes further because some of those agencies weren't only in the room, but were actively involved with the project. And I think, that's the second point.
Yeah, it just, for such a dramatic event, it's implausible that people didn't remember. And at a minimum, I'll bet you there's all kinds of people that were in that room or tangential, associated with it in some fashion, that went back after the COVID outbreak happened and privately looked at that all over again. It's impossible that they're not connecting the two dots. And, we know that that whole proposal was ultimately turned down because it was gain of function. That we're concerned that this, A, it's gain of function, and B, it's something that could morph into a real virus and get out into the wild. And that's exactly what happened. So, we've been asking for a long time, why was the government so heavily invested? Why was the intelligence community so heavily invested? Why was the DOD so heavily invested in keeping the information from getting out? Well, I guess we could say we still don't entirely know the answer to that question, but once you stay silent, the need to continue to stay silent grows with each passing day. And the longer these people stayed silent and, seemingly tried to help cover things up, the deeper things went. Although I still don't think we've arrived fully at that answer yet.
No, we have not. And I'm sure you felt the same this week when this stuff came out. As I said, I'm at the affiliate office of HARDFACTS, so I was really doing other things, but this one, it was just immediately caught my attention. I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to put everything aside here and just focus on this. Simply because it's just so massive, it's so huge, and it's just one of those things. I'm sure previously on the show we would have said, well, we kind of know the story, but we would have also said, maybe there's going to be another shoe that's going to drop. And I think you're absolutely right. There's going to be more and more. There's going to be stuff that we're going to find out in the coming year or so, which we would have never believed to have been true or possible, even just a few months ago. We sort of had the idea that, Daszak had this blueprint and the Wuhan lab went ahead and so on. But now we find out that all these US government agencies knew. If you told me that even last week, I would have said, nah, not all of them. Well, they were all there at this DARPA Proposers Day. I think we can move on to the second issue here now, is the people who didn't only know, or weren't only in attendance, but who actually actively participated in the whole process. And of course, the shame and the guilt is much, much stronger with those people. Not that they would show it or admit it, but it is. I think, first of all, let's talk about Vincent Munster. So Vincent Munster is a guy who runs the Rocky Mountain lab. That's a Fauci lab. That's a NIAID lab. And he was a part of the DEFUSE proposal, of this blueprint for making COVID in lab. We didn't know that. His name obviously at some point disappeared from the proposal. And in the end, it was Daszak, it was Ralph Barrick from the University of North Carolina, it was Shijing Li from the Wuhan lab, it was Wang Lin Fa from various associations, also with the Wuhan lab, and it was Tony Rock from the U.S. Geological Survey, and we discussed this on a previous show. Her involvement is how we found out so much in the first place, because the U.S. Geological Survey they're not good at fighting these FOIA wars. They're not like NIAID where they just block everything. So they handed out her emails, and that's how we found out about a lot of this stuff that they were discussing, like what we mentioned, for instance, earlier, that Daszak had a secret plan to move all this stuff to Wuhan as soon as he got the money. Okay, so those were the 5 who were involved. We did not know about Vincent Munster. That's new. And that is so huge because he is NIAID. He's literally in Fauci's office, this guy. And he was part of the DEFUSE proposal in 2018. So he would have known. And as you mentioned, the blueprint, it's a blueprint for making COVID in a lab. Now, some might argue you make a COVID-like virus. It might not be exactly like COVID. Well, that doesn't matter. You can follow that blueprint and you might come out with 10 different COVID-like viruses, but they all have the COVID-like features. So, and the one that came out, well, is COVID-19, the one we all encountered and the one that, caused so much destruction. So I don't know, what did you think of NIAID, a NIAID guy showing up in DEFUSE?
Well, first, my response to everything was, holy smokes! Like as you were, I didn't expect it to be 15 federal agencies, and the fact that the cover-up's even bigger than we thought, and people had to know instantaneously what had happened. And then there was the jaded part of me that was like, of course, NIAID had somebody there. Of course, they were part of it. We know how desperately Fauci tried to cover things up and, engineered his teleconference to get the natural origin promoted. So I guess I had sort of two-sided reactions to it. My first reaction was, I can't believe what I'm looking at. This many people knew. We're not just kind of new on the side, but we're literally part of the process in one way or another. And then the other side of me was like, yeah, of course. The other element that I was surprised about who was involved in this project was Ian Lipkin. The fact that Lipkin was on the proposal itself as well, another individual who was part of the original proposal and then ultimately wasn't. And Lipkin is a virologist, has never disclosed the fact that he was part of the DEFUSE proposal. I couldn't believe that either. Through all of this process, how did he not disclose that? And it's a pattern we've seen. Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. It's just astounding, especially because he's on proximal origin.
Yeah, it's at every basis, these people have refused to disclose their conflicts of interest. Peter Daszak in the Lancet letter, the people who wrote the proximal origin paper, those two papers went hand in hand. Both not terribly scientific, although the Lancet letter was arguably a lot worse than was the proximal fraud paper, but none of those disclosures, conflicts of interest were made. Peter Hotez, same thing, refused to disclose his conflicts of interest. Ultimately, I think Daszak was forced to disclose some conflicts of interest, but only after they were discovered by outside folks like us, where he was dragged kicking and screaming to the fire. And, Nature magazine had basically no choice but to put a small disclaimer, which even now isn't a particularly fair one, let alone they haven't withdrawn the entirety of the paper. That should have happened as well. But it's fundamentally alarming that all of these people knew and instead actively engaged in a cover-up.
I'd like to come back to Lipkin here. It's such an important point, and I think it's been kind of largely missed. Obviously, in some small corners of Twitter, it has not been missed. But
Twitter virology hasn't missed it, but everywhere else has.
That's right, because again, in the bigger scheme of things, in the bigger scheme that we're talking about here, cover-up, all these people who didn't say a word, all this kind of stuff. The Lipkin case is perhaps sort of the poster child of it. I don't think I've ever seen a worse case of conflict of interest and lying by omission and just being totally fraudulent. And I think why this is so particularly bad, and this point hasn't really come across, is because the guy who was involved with DEFUSE, the proposal to make COVID-like viruses at the Wuhan lab, is also the guy on the proximal origin paper, which is the go-to, so supposedly scientific explanation why this thing is 100% natural. I mean, it is. In some of these instances, they at least tried to create some distance. They wouldn't put Lipkin on the paper, so they put Anderson on the paper on proximal origin, because Anderson had nothing to do with the Wuhan lab, so he can have this sort of semblance of being independent. but they actually had Lipkin on the paper. Well, we knew that, but what we didn't know, we knew Lipkin had Wuhan lab connections, and we knew that's a conflict, and we knew there's many other problems with this guy. Also, CCP awards and all the usual stuff. But what we didn't know, and this makes it so bad, doubly, triply bad, is that he was both on the proximal origin and on diffuse. So I don't think we've ever had that kind of overlap so far in this whole story.
That's why that was sort of the element that almost had me falling out of my chair more than some of the other elements. Because, Lipkin's somebody we've known about. You and I have both written about him and his involvement. And the fact that this entire time, nobody knew, nobody outside of the 15 governmental agencies that we're talking about knew that he was part of the original proposal. And it just kind of leaves you speechless in terms of what do you even say to something like this. And I think he's, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, he stayed pretty quiet on this. I haven't seen any responses out of him publicly.
This is the worst part. He's sort of been hiding in a cave somewhere. He hasn't gotten the flack that Anderson and Gary have gotten, obviously totally deserved. But now that we know what we know, Lipkin perhaps deserves it even more. I mean, They all lied on the paper. They all lied equally, and that's their paper. But the fact that Lipkin was on diffuse, it just makes it so much worse. I don't think I've ever seen anything as bad in all of science ever. Like, it's that bad.
When this news broke, Hans, what I found myself thinking about was all these disinformation agents that suddenly came into the room. So, right as we began to feel that we had definitive proof that it was a lab leak, that everything meshed up perfectly, the way the virus was constructed, the materials that Daszak ordered as part of the project, et cetera, and felt like, okay, there is no doubt. I don't think you and I ever had any great doubt in our minds to begin with. But in terms of sort of certifiable proof that could be presented, academically before everybody, even the number of virologists that we interact with all seem to feel the same way. Okay, this is hard, tangible proof that it came out of a lab, it was engineered, it was constructed. And it was right at that moment that all of a sudden these new so-called disinformation experts, people who had no experience with virology, with COVID whatsoever, came into the play. And we were, I think at the time, we, at least I know for myself, sort of thought, well, okay, that's because their timing is such that it's related to this definitive proof about the origin of COVID. That may well have been, but it also now with this disclosure feels like it was in preparation for, these other shoes that are dropping.
You're absolutely right. So this started in December of 2023 when those documents dropped. This was the one through Tony Rock's agency, the U.S. Geological Survey, what we talked about a few minutes ago. That's how we got the FOIAs about the fact that Daszak actually wanted to do all this stuff in Wuhan once he got the 14 million, because he says that in those documents. And that was pretty big news. But I remember you and I, and I'm sure we did a show on it at the time as well, we're like, this, even though this is very bad, this is it's really just par for the course as far as Daszak is concerned. So why is it that all of these disinformation merchants, Sander and all these people are suddenly coming out of the woodwork? And I completely agree with you. They knew other shoes were going to drop, and other shoes have dropped. And obviously now this one is perhaps the biggest one. Both the fact that, as you said, the 15 agencies is what made the headlines. And yeah, it's pretty bad. But both the fact that NIAID and Munster was directly involved, Fauci's agency was directly involved with the plan to make COVID. And of course, Lipkin having that dual role. So I completely agree. This was like a preemptive disinformation. And anyway, we found out the truth in any case.
Well, it also answered another question for us because the Tony Rock papers were important, the emails, because what it showed is that she knew, and with the U.S. Department of Geology, I probably don't have the title correct, but one of the things that puzzled us about that, okay, why didn't she come forward? But we were puzzling over why is this kind of obscure agency how did they get involved? And suddenly now that you have this disclosure that there's 15 federal agencies, you kind of go, ah, okay, that's why. She was just one of the agencies, probably at the margin, that was involved in this. And it just so happened that we got an email, relating to her and from her and relating to her agency. And so, kind of tip of the iceberg. Think about all the other emails that we haven't seen from the other, probably more involved agencies in all this.
Supposedly, she was involved because of her expertise in animal inoculation.
Right.
Because the whole thing, and again, I think this is something that hasn't been reported at all, not even in the good media, is how completely crazy, how completely madcap, just crazy professor, totally mad, this proposal actually was. They wanted to creating
Batshit,
COVID
full
in the
on
lab,
mad scientist crazy.
or beyond. The creating COVID in a lab was just the first step. It was a 3-step process. And I think, I think by now most people have heard that there was a blueprint for making COVID in the lab in 2018 at the Wuhan lab, which is very, very bad. But then the next step, phase 2, was to create a vaccine for the COVID that they created in the lab. And then step 3 was to use the vaccine to inoculate bats in the wild. Like they were going to take these big giant spray machines into these caves in China and just start spraying everything and somehow inoculate the bats so that then they wouldn't pass on these viruses to humans. It's just, and then the justification for it all, this is the craziest part. I still can't quite believe it. The justification for all of that was to protect U.S. Military personnel from viruses in Chinese caves. That was the official justification.
I always wonder about that a little bit because that was such a strange element of the proposal. Is we haven't had any outbreaks, right? There's plenty of people that lived around these bat caves, and the CCP, once the outbreak happened, they just absolutely sealed that area down. The pandemic sprung up 1,500 miles away. There was no intervening infections. The local people, if I recall correctly, they did some blood work on them and they found some antibodies, etc. But there was no outbreak locally. So what was the reason that they came up with this crazy proposal to deliver an aerosol vaccine effectively within the bat caves? It almost makes me wonder what other experiments were going on there that we don't know about. Was there something that they were concerned about within those caves that's yet to actually come out? Was there some sort of reverse introduction of something? I mean, that's wild speculation, but nevertheless, what they were planning was so unusual that I can't understand the rationale behind wanting to do it. It was this crazy solution for a problem that seemingly was non-existent.
No, the problem does not exist. I think there's a dual purpose. I think the number one purpose was grift, just grifters. That's as simple as that. 14 million on top of all the Fauci million, on top of all the other money. And then you look at Daszak, with his first class flights, because, supposedly has a bad back or whatever, some excuse. And, all the giant salary. I mean, he's like on 400K plus. For a charity, please, Anyway, and then you have, I think the other purpose is the sort of the IC purpose, which we still don't know that much about. Like we know that we've discussed this before, that the Wuhan lab is a CCP lab and that they were part of the 1,000 Talent program and all this stuff. So, the idea of getting some eyes and ears into the lab via these kinds of madcap projects, but that in itself is a pretty madcap idea.
Yeah, and I was speaking very specifically of the aerosol vaccine within the caves, not the rest of it.
No, you're absolutely right. It is because anyone with a functioning brain who comes across this is just going to shake their heads and say, what are you guys doing? And I think people also don't understand that the inherent risk of these viruses is absolutely tiny. What people always forget is even though SARS was made out to be this ginormous thing, right? 774 people died worldwide. No one died in the US. I don't even think anyone had it in the US. I mean, it's just because it was not very spreadable. I mean, 774 people die all the time because of some, disaster, some this, some that. I mean, it's a tragedy, but, it's not like end of the world kind of stuff, unlike, SARS-2, COVID. That was getting us closer to end of the world kind of stuff. And of course, we know why, because one was transmissible and the other one wasn't, because they had manipulated in the lab. But it just shows you, SARS-1 shows you that the inherent risk is just not very high. I mean, the guys who got sick in the Mojang mine in 2012, which is perhaps where one of the building blocks of COVID came from, because the Wuhan lab eventually isolated that virus that made those guys sick who were in the bat caves. Those guys spent days and weeks in a bat cave scraping the guano off the walls, and they had all the powder and all the aerosolized stuff and whatever is in, and you're in an environment with no air movement, no wind, no nothing. They were in this highly concentrated environment with all this bad stuff for weeks, and then 3 of them got sick. So in other words, normal people just aren't at risk. So the idea that a US soldier would get sick because of some bat in a cave in Mojang, which is in the middle of China, is just ludicrous. And the idea that US taxpayers should give Daszak 14 million in order to somehow avert that is just, anyone who came across that would have just had to have shaken their head. That's my view. And therefore I completely agree with you that there is still something else there. I mean, the grift is so extreme that it can't just be grift, because you'd just be laughed out of the room.
Yeah, it was that specific part of the proposal because they didn't need to include that, and that was so one-off. And, again, it's worth noting that nobody got sick at those caves. The Mojang mine is a separate area, a couple 100 miles distant. They were working in this other area with bat caves. Then in 2012, Xi Zhengli heard about these miners getting sick. They suddenly transferred their operations over there, or at least a portion of them, and began looking into this. But your larger point about SARS-1 and 774 people dying. So the entire premise of all this work was to prevent some sort of global pandemic. And they kept pointing back to SARS-1. And again, SARS-1 was something that was scary, but virtually nobody was actually fundamentally affected by it. The solution to that perceived problem ended up getting us COVID. The idea that the rationale for all the work that they were doing ended up translating to the real problem is something that shouldn't be overlooked. We've said it a number of times that SARS-1 was overplayed, and people need to understand it's very difficult for people to actually get infected. Well, as part of the solution to that perceived problem, they created something that infected everybody and that was specifically tailored for human infection.
And it wasn't a problem to begin with, or not one that would have any big impact. I mean, we're never going to make everything perfect in the world, so once in a while this thing might happen. As you say, you went from 774 deaths to natural to 20 million deaths not natural. I think we should also move on here to Samantha Power, because that's kind of the third leg here. So the first one was the 15 agencies, and the second one was the involvement of people whom we didn't know were involved in the actual DEFUSE proposal. And then the third thing we haven't really talked about yet that we found out from Rand Paul this week is we knew that USAID was involved with this one experiment, but what we didn't know is that Samantha Power would go before Congress and deny it. I was just blown away by that.
Well, first of all, I'll just be honest. I haven't looked very closely into the Samantha Power issue yet, so I'm not going to be super intelligent here. But when I saw that she was involved, I almost just sort of thought, well, of course she is. I haven't heard much from her lately. And she was a central figure in Russiagate, and all of these Russiagate figures have gotten recycled and brought back into the fold. And I guess I was kind of unsurprised to see that she was there. And of course she lied to Congress.
You're absolutely right. Lisa Monaco recycled her, Victoria Nuland recycled her, and Samantha Power recycled her. So she's now head of USAID. By the way, USAID is one of these agencies where it sounds good, but I doubt there's any actual good coming out of it. This is the US Development Agency. So they just send money all over the world to supposedly develop places. So one of the places they sent money, and again, she denied this, but it is demonstrably true because it's on the paper in Nature magazine in 2015, right? With that was the experiment where Xi Zhengli and Ralph Barrick, for the first time, kind of played together and came up with this new virus. It not quite like COVID, but it was a step on that way. So they took a backbone out of a SARS virus, and then they inserted a new part, the receptor part, the receptor binding domain from another virus, and to see if it attaches to human cells any better. And it was also one of the first experiments we know where they were using these mice to see how to mimic whether the humans would be affected by them, because you don't want to put this new stuff into humans. So they put it into mice instead that mimic human lungs. And they found that this new stuff they created did have the potential of infecting these mice. Okay, that was the experiment in Wuhan. Well, Wuhan plus University of North Carolina. Can you explain to me how that has anything whatsoever to do with U.S. aid? Like helping poor people in wherever?
I would assume that there's a rationale that was put forth about vaccines, about once again pointing fingers at SARS and saying we're going to go after trying to figure out a way to prevent these things in the future. But it shows that let's assume for a moment that that's the rationale behind it. It shows how easy it is for these tentacles to get expanded and for funds to be directed anywhere on the most flimsy of excuses. And just by way of backdrop, think about what USAID does, just to put this in context. USAID is the same agency that's working with our State Department to fund all of these NGOs that are funneling the illegal immigration into our country. So they're literally, it's another mechanism to give money. We have designated funds that go to the UN, but then we have these federal agencies which get these enormous budgets and have discretionary funds that run into the billions of dollars that they can direct to the UN on a secondary basis by either paying it directly to the UN out of their own budgets or funding the NGOs. And so this whole buildup of the NGO network that's bringing the illegal immigration in our country, that's coming out of USAID. So that's another way that money is being used and directed. So that's, it kind of shows you the breadth of impact. I think that's one of the things that is difficult for people it's hard to even just imagine that all these different federal agencies are using your tax dollars to invoke their own kind of personal, vision of the future and putting your money in ways that act directly against the interest of the United States. But it's happening on an ongoing basis all the time and in huge amounts.
Correct. And it's gotten completely out of hand and it's completely ill-transparent and no one even knows.
Oh, there's no transparency.
And, I'm not even totally against the idea of sending money overseas. But there's a big, big but. The line has to be drawn very early and very sharply. And what I mean by that is you have to define, like an agency like USAID should only, first of all, should it even exist? And, I'm a bit torn on that, but okay, let's just say, yeah, maybe sometimes it's a good idea doing these things. It's kind of like international charity or whatever you want to call it. But if you do go ahead and do it, you have to clearly define it in such a strong way that there is no mission drift. You don't, as you say, end up funding all these asylum seekers or economic refugees, we should really call them. You don't suddenly fund reckless virus experiments at the Wuhan lab because of some secondary purpose, as you say, probably vaccines, or they come up with some secondary or even tertiary purpose, like, oh, that's why we need the money. No, you don't need the money. If I was in charge, I would, maybe get rid of it. And if I wasn't going to get rid of it, I would say, you can build wells, or maybe you can build houses. It has to be a primary purpose, something physical, something that's immediate in terms of the benefit it brings to the communities where it goes. And that's it. No secondary purposes like, oh, maybe if we do this, then this will happen and this will encourage this and then that will. No, none of that. Just some very tangible stuff, build stuff that are like, say, roads, houses, wells, or whatever, and that's it. You cannot do anything else because, and I haven't looked into their history, but I guess that's sort of how it started. And as you just mentioned, it's now gone all over the map, doing all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah, and the problem with that is we've seen this time and time again. There's something called the DOJ slush fund, and they were taking settlements from the financial crisis. There's now a DOJ slush fund too, by the way, which hasn't really been talked about that much. But and they find ways to get money and then dispense it, and it's always to left-leaning causes, always, 100% of the time. And the reason for that is because on the right, they typically have no interest in funding those causes, where on the left, that's very much their intent. And the problem that I have is they're always able to find an excuse. They're always, a lot of times they just don't care. If they can get the money, they'll spend it and deal with the consequences later. And with the DOJ slush fund, that's what they did, to the tune of billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. If you want to know where, community activist groups like La Raza and all these others got their funding, it came from there. And they just did it until they basically finally, after years of Congress beating on them, Grassley and others, they finally were stopped. Jeff Sessions put a stop to the DOJ slush fund 1. Again, there is another one now. But they just kind of don't care. So I more fall on the line of this funding needs to be cut, because they're always going to find a way to abuse it and to use it. And it effectively doubles the payments that we give to the UN. Not effectively, it doubles it. It's the amounts that we know of are the same amounts that we officially pay the UN. So whatever we officially pay the UN, I believe it's $7 billion. That number is more than doubled through the federal agencies.
Yeah, but even if someone were to say, no, they do serve some purpose, and if someone doesn't buy into this argument, by the way, I do, that there's always going to be mission drift, you're never going to be able to stop it.
Right.
So maybe my proposal earlier just isn't going to work for that reason. But whatever your point of view, I think everyone ought to agree, just automatically off the bat, that US aid should not be funding gain-of-function experiments in a hostile country at a CCP lab. I mean, just hopefully everyone could agree on that. And second of all, the director of USAID should then not go before Congress and lie about the fact that happened when it's documented. That shows you the chutzpah of these people, that there is a publication in Nature. It's been around for 9 years. You can find it in a library. You can find it online. You can find it it exists. And it says USAID funded this stuff.
You're talking about the 2016-15 Barrick Xi Zhengli proposal, or paper on their experiments.
COVID, where they were honing their skills in creating something like COVID by inserting things into virus backbones and so on.
It was a whole new level of gain of function. That was the one
Exactly.
that Ebright had a heart attack about.
First of all, don't fund that. But now that you did, don't go before Congress and lie about it. But there will be, on that second point, there won't be consequences, because there's never consequences. When whoever else goes before Congress, if it's a Trump associate, they immediately get slapped with an indictment if they say anything that's wrong. And I'm not defending these people. There's a lot of kind of unseemly types among them, But Samantha Power, Fauci, whoever else, they can say whatever they want, and nothing ever happens.
Well, I mean, we haven't seen consequences in anything. There's no consequences for Russiagate. There's no consequences for the abuse of the FISA system. There's no consequences for what the CIA has. There's never any consequences. Just real quick, I do want to bring us back to one thing. It's an interesting topic, but we drifted a little bit, coming back to what, Rand Paul was putting out. And I guess I have 2 points. One, why is it only Rand Paul? Why isn't it everybody? And secondarily is something that we also have talked about before, is the delay tactics that are implemented by the intelligence community so effectively that by the time they stall. And by the time this information drifts out, so what Rand Paul put out there about the 15 federal agencies, that should have been front page news everywhere. And that's why it didn't come out until now. Right now, at this point in time, it's hard to even get people's full attention on something like this. And that's precisely what the intelligence community knew was going to happen. And as we started off by talking about, we're going to find out more information in a little while, and it's going to be worse. But the delay has gone on so long that the public's ability to care about it, they've just kind of moved on. It's not capturing the attention, and then therefore it's not capturing the accountability or demands for accountability.
100%. If they knew what they were doing, and by they, I mean Fauci and the people who were sort of behind all this. I mean, on the secret teleconference at the beginning of all this, the one that led to proximal origin, the whole cover up, there was intelligence community involvement because Jeremy Farah, the guy who co-organized it together with Fauci, that's the British Pharmaceutical Trust guy who also had his ties to China, as he admitted it. He admitted the involvement of English intelligence in this whole matter. We have the email from Fauci about US IC involvement. We know that the FBI was shut off from investigating this. Maybe for once they were trying to be the good guys. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of shoes that still need to drop, but I completely agree with you. They knew exactly what they were doing, because if they had not shut it down, to your point, if they had not shut it down back in February of 2020, and if it had become sort of a bit of a snowball effect, an avalanche effect, where it just grows bigger and bigger, because we saw those slight beginnings when Xiao Baotou, remember that guy, the whistleblower in China who said this came out of a lab, and he put out a paper, and the CCP immediately took down the paper, but we had it. Imagine if that had kind of spread, if more people had known about that. We had all these other people who then pitched in, again, on Twitter, people we know, virologists who were honest, who were trying to get the message out. Imagine if that had been reported, and if people had realized, oh my God, this came out of a Chinese lab. And I mean, realized before they got sick with it, because all that happened later. All the people dying, all the people getting sick, everything being shut down and so on, that happened afterwards. So imagine the outcry and the outrage. This came out of a lab, and now all these consequences, all our lives are upended, all that kind of stuff. It would have led to some giant consequences for China, for virologists, for what we just talked about, because people would have been so angry because they were going through all this horrible stuff
in real time.
But now, 4 years later, it's like people hardly remember all the crap they went through. So the outrage isn't there. And I completely agree with you. They probably knew we're not going to keep this quiet forever. But if it, drips out over the next 5 or 10 years, there are not going to be any consequences. And in a way, it's like Russiagate, isn't it? If we'd known in, say, November, December of 2016, what we know now, everything would have been very different.
Yeah, and one other thing there, don't forget about the State Department email, the internal assessment in April of 2020, in the early days of COVID, that determined that absolutely this is a lab leak. And not only is it they analyzed the 5 different theories for COVID, and said not only is it absolutely certain that it was a lab leak, but that these other theories had been introduced to distract from the real possibility, the fact that it was a lab leak. In other words, that the natural origin had been distinctly entered into the common discussion as a means to distract from what really happened. And what did the IC do with that? They immediately squelched it. They ran, we've talked about this in an earlier show, but they put that assessment, their COVID assessment out through Grinnell's DNI office, and said that the virus was not man-made and hadn't been manufactured in a lab, et cetera, et cetera. And they did that specifically to squelch reporting on that State Department memo, which then, was hidden under a rock for another 3 years.
Exactly right. And well, now kind of drip, we're finding out. And as we mentioned earlier, I think we're going to find out this week was pretty bad. Some really bad stuff. I think it might even get worse.
It's going to get worse. Yeah.
The Fauci personally knowing about DEFUSE in detail, things like that. I think that's still on the horizon here.
So we kind of come back. I think we both agree it's going to get worse. Is anybody going to care? Is anybody going to be held accountable? Is Fauci going to go on happily living in his $19 million estate? Unfortunately, I guess I'd put my money on that not much is going to happen. And I hope that I'm wrong, and I hope that Rand Paul can continue to raise these issues, but that these issues get the proper attention they deserve. Because
I agree with you. Probably no consequences, but we'll keep reading it, we'll keep analyzing it, and we'll keep discussing it. So we'll do our little part of keeping the flame alive here.
Yeah.